Welcome back to the Beautiful Chaos podcast. Today we're going to be doing a deep dive into a story it's making headlines everywhere, really. The indictment of former Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro.
Yeah.
And this isn't just like your run-of-the-mill political scandal. This is about an alleged attempt to, completely overturn Brazilian democracy.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. It is a fascinating case, and the accusations are incredibly serious.
Yeah.
Bolsonaro is facing multiple charges. We're talking participating in an armed criminal organization attempting to violently overthrow the rule of law,
Wow.
and even attempting a coup d'etat.
A coup d'etat. I mean, that's something you usually only read about in history books, right? What does that even mean, in today's world?
Yeah, so a coup d'etat is basically when you illegally take power from a government.
Right.
And in Bolsonaro's case, he's accused of basically orchestrating this plot to overturn the results of the 2022 election, which, of course, he lost to Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva.
And the details of this alleged plot are pretty wild. They mention plans to assassinate key figures, including President Lula himself and Supreme Court Justice Alexander de Moraes.
Right.
And then there's this chilling plan. They're calling it Green and Yellow Dagger.
Yeah, it's pretty intense. The indictment basically paints a picture of this coordinated effort to just sow chaos and distrust in the whole electoral system. They allege that Bolsonaro and his allies spent years spreading disinformation about Brazil's electronic voting system,
Oh, wow.
which is very similar to what we saw with Donald Trump and his attacks on the U.S. election system.
It's just amazing how social media has become such a powerful tool for spreading that kind of disinformation.
It really is a double-edged sword. I mean, on the one hand, it allows for this rapid spread of information,
Right.
and it connects people across borders. But on the other hand, it creates these echo chambers and makes it so easy to manipulate public opinion with false or misleading narratives.
And it seems like in Bolsonaro's case, this alleged disinformation campaign was part of this bigger strategy to weaken democratic institutions and undermine trust in the whole electoral process.
Exactly, and that's why this case is being watched so closely all over the world. It's a test case for how democracies are supposed to respond to these kinds of threats, especially in this era of rising populism and authoritarianism.
What's interesting is that Brazil's response to this alleged coup attempt has been pretty swift and decisive, especially compared to what we've seen in other countries facing similar situations.
Oh, for sure. I mean, the indictment itself is massive. It's an 884-page federal police report.
Wow, 884 cages.
And it implicates 33 individuals, including Bolsonaro's former spy, chief defense ministers, other high-ranking officials. They even mentioned this Argentinian political consultant, Fernando Cerramedo.
Wait, Argentinian consultant?
Yeah.
That suggests a level of international coordination in this alleged plot that's kind of scary.
It definitely raises questions about the potential involvement of far-right networks operating across borders. And it really just underscores the global nature of the threat to democracy that we're facing today.
So how has the international community reacted to this indictment?
The response has been pretty positive for the most part. A lot of people are praising Brazil's commitment to upholding the rule of law. Media outlets all over the world have highlighted the contrast between Brazil's swift legal action and the more drawn-out legal battles in the U.S. after the January 6th insurrection.
It seems like Brazil is sending a clear message that attempts to undermine democracy will not be tolerated.
And that's a powerful message to send, especially right now when we're seeing democratic backsliding in so many parts of the world.
But I'm sure not everyone in Brazil is happy with this indictment.
Oh, absolutely not.
Yeah.
Bolsonaro still has a huge following, and many of his supporters see this as a politically motivated witch hunt.
Right.
And that brings us to a really critical point. The legal proceedings are important, of course, but they don't really address the underlying societal divisions that allowed someone like Bolsonaro to gain power in the first place.
It seems like this case is really exposing just how polarized Brazilian society is.
For sure. And that's something that we're seeing play out in democracies all around the world.
Yeah.
The question is, how do we bridge those divides and strengthen democratic institutions in a way that brings people together and protects against these kinds of threats in the future?
That's a great question, and one that I think we need to explore further.
And that's where Brazil's 1988 constitution comes in.
Okay, the Constitution. Why is that so important in all of this?
Well, this constitution was drafted right after Brazil transitioned from a military dictatorship to a democracy.
Oh, right.
So it was designed specifically to safeguard against authoritarianism. It emphasizes things like civil liberties, due process, the separation of powers.
So it basically created the framework for a strong and independent judiciary.
Exactly. And that independence is so crucial in a case like this. I mean, it means that the courts can theoretically operate without political pressure or interference, which allows them to actually uphold the rule of law, even when it comes to really powerful figures like a former president.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah,
It's about making sure that no one is above the law, no matter how powerful they are.
exactly. And that's why the international community is watching so closely how Brazil's judiciary handles this whole thing. It's like a litmus test for the strength of their democratic institutions.
It's like the world is watching to see if Brazil can actually deliver on its promise of justice and accountability.
Yeah, and it's not just about Brazil.
Right.
This case has the potential to set a precedent for how other countries deal with similar threats to their own democracies.
So if Bolsonaro is convicted, it could send a strong message to other leaders who might be thinking about following in his footsteps.
Exactly. It could embolden other countries to, take a stronger stance against attempts to undermine democracy. But on the flip side,
Yeah.
it could also trigger a backlash from Bolsonaro supporters and further entrench the polarization we've been talking about.
That's what worries me. It feels like we're on this tightrope walk. On one hand, we need to defend democracy and hold those accountable who try to undermine it. But on the other hand, we don't want to alienate people or push those who already feel disenfranchised further away.
It's a really delicate balance for sure. And it highlights the need for these broader conversations, as a society about how to address the root causes of this polarization. Because ultimately, you can have strong democratic institutions,
Yeah.
but they can only thrive in a society where there's a shared commitment to those democratic values and a willingness to, have respectful dialogue even when you disagree.
Right, I agree completely. But I'm curious, do you think this focus on legal action, while important, of course, might be overshadowing the need for those broader conversations?
That's a great point. It's easy to get caught up in the drama of the legal proceedings, but we can't forget about the things that contributed to this situation in the first place.
Right.
Things like economic inequality, social injustice, the erosion of trust in traditional institutions.
And the role of misinformation.
Exactly.
I mean, Bolsonaro spent years spreading these lies and conspiracy theories, which undoubtedly contributed to this climate of distrust and division.
Absolutely. And the way misinformation just spreads like wildfire on social media makes it so hard to combat.
Yeah,
It's like a virus that infects public discourse.
right.
And it makes it almost impossible to have rational conversations based on facts and evidence.
So what can we do about it? How do we
Yeah.
protect ourselves against this virus of misinformation?
It's a tough question with no easy answers,
Yeah.
but I think it starts with media literacy education.
Okay.
Teaching people how to critically evaluate the information they see online and recognize the signs of disinformation.
So it's about empowering people to be more discerning about the information they consume.
Exactly. And it's also about holding social media companies accountable for the content that's shared on their platforms. They need to be doing more to combat the spread of misinformation and create spaces for healthy dialogue.
And this is a conversation that's happening all over the world, right? I mean, this issue of misinformation and its impact on democracy, it's not just a Brazil problem.
Absolutely not. It's a global challenge that requires countries to work together. We need to share best practices, come up with common strategies, and work together to protect our democratic values in this digital age.
This all seems incredibly daunting. I mean, where do we even start to tackle such a huge problem?
It's easy to feel overwhelmed for sure, but I think it's important to remember that change starts at the individual level. We each have a responsibility to be critical thinkers,
Right.
to engage in respectful dialogue, and to stand up for democratic values in our own communities. Those individual actions, when multiplied across society, can have a big impact.
I like that. It's about recognizing that we all have a role to play in safeguarding democracy. Even small actions, when we all do them together, can make a big difference.
Exactly. And it's about remembering that democracy isn't something you just watch from the sidelines. It requires active participation from all of us.
That's been a really enlightening conversation.
Yeah.
But as we move into the final part of our deep dive, I'm wondering, what are some of the big lessons we can learn from what's happening in Brazil? And what are the potential implications for the future of global democracy?
Right.
So we've been talking about this really complex situation in Brazil with this former president indicted for allegedly trying to overturn the election results.
Yeah, it's a story with a lot of different angles to it, like legal, political, social.
Right.
And it really shows just how fragile democracy can be, not just in Brazil, but all over the world.
And, as we wrap up this deep dive, I keep thinking back to that Argentinian consultant who was mentioned in the indictment. It just really highlights how these threats to democracy They can be connected across borders.
Yeah, it's a really important point.
Hmm.
We tend to think of elections and stuff as like national events, but the truth is these threats are often linked internationally.
Right.
We're seeing the rise of these far-right networks, the spread of all this disinformation, and it's like they're using the same playbook to undermine democracy in different places.
It almost feels like there's this global movement with people like Bolsonaro and Trump using the same kind of rhetoric and strategies, even though they're from different countries.
There are definitely some similarities. The way they use misinformation, the attacks on the media and the judiciary, trying to make people lose faith in the whole voting process.
Right.
These are all tactics that we're seeing used by populist leaders around the world.
And that's what makes Brazil's response so important.
Yeah.
If they can actually hold Bolsonaro accountable, it could send a message to other leaders who are thinking about going down that same path.
It could be a turning point, for sure. It could show that those tactics won't work and that there are real consequences if you try to mess with democracy.
But there's also the chance of things backfiring.
Oh, definitely. Bolsonaro's got a lot of supporters, and a lot of them think this indictment is just a political attack. A conviction could make those tensions even worse and divide the country even more.
So where do we go from here? What does this all mean for the future of global democracy? Are we headed for some kind of showdown between democracy and authoritarianism?
It's definitely a possibility, but there are also reasons to be hopeful.
Okay.
The fact that people all over the world are paying attention to this case, the fact that democracies are working together and supporting each other, the fact that people are standing up for their rights, those are all good signs.
So it's not like it's a done deal. There's still time to turn things around.
Exactly. But it takes all of us being aware and engaged and committed to democratic values. We can't just sit back and do nothing.
And that brings us back to something you said earlier about the importance of each person taking action. It can feel overwhelming to think about these big global problems, but each of us can make a difference.
Absolutely. It starts with staying informed and questioning the information we see, having respectful conversations even when we disagree, and holding our leaders accountable,
Right.
and supporting groups that are working to make democracy stronger and fight against misinformation.
It's about realizing that democracy is not something you just watch. It's something we all have to be a part of and protect.
That's a great way to put it. The future of democracy really depends on all of us.
Well said. Well, on that note, we're going to wrap up this deep dive. Thanks for joining us on this journey. We hope you'll keep thinking about this important issue and share your own thoughts and ideas. Until next time, stay curious and stay engaged.